What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to episode 50 of the Book Binge, where this time on the show we are talking about my top 10 favorite books of 2022 to continue my year of 2022 wrap up. Now, I obviously did my year in review video that I did on the 1st of this month. Over the course of the rest of this month and in February on Thursdays, I'll be doing a lot of tier list videos where I basically talk about and to some extent rank all of the books that I read in 2022. This video is going to be limited to just my 10 favorites. Now, for this video, before we get right into the meat of it, I do want to talk about a couple stipulations that I have for this list and the rules for the discussion of my ranking. First off, this year, rereads are not inherently ineligible. The reason why I have decided to do this is because plenty of what I read this year was a reread, and because of the next rule, which is basically only one book per series per author. That doesn't necessarily mean that there cannot be more than one book written by an author if an author I read had written 2 series, if that makes any sense. Now, what this also means is that if I had read, say, for example, the entirety of Realm of the Elderlings in 2022, I probably would allow myself to pick a book from each of the individual series within. I know to a certain extent some people would consider that cheating, but for me, I don't read very fast, and that means that I don't get a whole ton of books read, and with these 2 rules, it gives me a little bit more to choose from. Second off, there will be a top 10 in this video, but there will also be 5 honorable mentions before we get to the final one. And I think that might be all that I actually have to talk about explicitly in this video. So let's move right on into the ranking. Up first at number 10 on this list is going to be The Last Olympian by Rick Riordan. I have some friends who are going to make fun of me for this pick and, take your pick between the hardcover or the paperback editions of this book. The reason that I am putting this on the list is because I do believe that The Last Olympian is very much a very good book, and it's a wonderful closer and, the conclusion to the series as a whole. For an author that I grew up loving, an author that I grew up reading, pretty much the author that made me love reading in the first place, The Last Olympian is one that satisfies the entirety of the series and I believe holds up tremendously. It is probably the best of the entire series by a good bit. And because I'm allowing myself to count rereads in this, it gives me the option to talk about this book a little bit here. Since if I didn't allow myself to do rereads, there would be a couple picks on this list that I don't necessarily feel like would be actual top 10s of the year for me. So that is number 10. Number 9 on this list is, well, it's another Rick Riordan book, but that is The Serpent's Shadow by Rick Riordan in the King Chronicles trilogy. The reason why I am inclined to include this one on the list as well is for similar reasons, that it being a wonderful conclusion, because Rick Riordan just has a wonderful way of being able to tie things up, include a lot of loose ends, including stuff that you didn't even remember being loose ends, and using them to wrap up a finale that is truly fantastic, wonderful, and fully satisfying. So even though there are a bunch of copy edit errors in this book, I believe that this is one worthy of being in my top 10, one that I actually had forgotten most of. So not only do I think it holds up, but it was one that I experienced mostly blind because I had forgotten almost everything about it at the time that I originally read it. Next up at number 8 is actually, I believe, the first book that I read over the year, and that was Return of the King by J.R.R. Tolkien. I'll go ahead and show off multiple editions that I have. A movie edition, mass market. This book was really, really, really good. In fact, like I was somebody who wasn't expecting to love my journey through Lord of the Rings for whatever reason, because the first 2 times that I gotten through, I hadn't finished it. The first time I didn't get past the Tom Bombadil section of Fellowship of the King. The second time I believe I finished the 2 Towers, but then never went on from there, but I'd forgotten a lot. So when I went through and I read the first 2 Lord of the Rings books in 2021 and then finished with Return of the King in 2022, I was fully satisfied with the conclusion. In fact, I think that the Scouring of the Shire is probably my favorite chapter in the entirety of the Lord of the Rings, and frankly, it's not even close. And I mention that specifically because that's one that I feel like a lot of people either love or hate. They either love the Scouring, or they think it doesn't really have a huge place in the story. I love the Scouring of the Shire, and honestly, the Scouring of the Shire being one of my favorite chapters, not just in this, but in the whole series, but also one of my favorite chapters of the entire year, means that Return of the King kind of had to be on my top 10 list just because of that chapter, to be quite honest. And before I have anybody, getting in the comments calling me a heathen for putting anything Lord of the Rings below number one, the reason that it's not number one is because, well, we all know it is the GOAT, but it's also based off of my personal enjoyment. I did not enjoy Return of the King necessarily more than I enjoyed any of the rest of the books on this list. Part of the reason a lot of the rest of the books on this list are above Return of the King is because of the surprise factor. And as we say that, I'm going to go ahead and move on to number 7, being War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, a gigantic book. This was a book that I really enjoyed reading, that I enjoyed getting to know the characters and being in their heads, and experiencing the interactions and the relationships between the characters and all the ups and downs that come with that. I think actually my least favorite part of War and Peace as a whole is actually the war sections of the book. The more peaceful sections where you get to spend more time with characters in situations that aren't combat are frankly the most enjoyable part of the story. And then, of course, the very much dreaded Epilogue 2, I did not dislike, especially not nearly as much as nearly everybody else did. Most people hate the Epilogue 2 with a passion and think that it should not have been in the book. I can see where they're coming from for sure, but I did not dislike it, and I think it did a much better job being like a series of essays exploring the themes of the book, better than Tolstoy's mini tangents that he sprinkled throughout the rest of the book. But if you have not read War and Peace, it is a lot easier than you are psyching yourself out to be. The only reason War and Peace is intimidating is because it's big. If it weren't big, it would be a very quick, very simple, very fast read. Even as is, it's pretty quick and simple. It's just long. So I recommend you read it. Coming in at number 6 on this ranking is probably my biggest surprise love of the year, one that I really hate ranking this low. That is American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, a book that I think that if you love it, you are loving it, and if you don't enjoy it, you hate it, because it has a very specific tone, very specific style, and does a lot of very specific things with it just in general that make it very difficult to enjoy if you are not sold on that tone and that style. If you were not fully sold on the book, being in the head of Patrick Bateman reading this book, you are not going to enjoy the book, especially because, I'm not going to lie, this book is kind of boring, and there's not really a plot to it. It's kind of just like the deranged ramblings of a psychopathic lunatic. Quite frankly, like that is what American Psycho is, but I enjoyed every single second of it, and it surprised me so much. I started reading this expecting to absolutely loathe the thing. I ended up loving it. So it's one that I think you should give a try to see if you are going to be one of those people who loves it. But if you do not find yourself enjoying it in the first half, the back half is not going to do anything for you. So I really enjoyed American Psycho. Coming in at number 5 was the first, I think it was the first classic that I read all year, which started off a long train of me reading a lot of classics throughout the year. As you could tell by there being War and Peace on this list, there will be another classic on this list and another couple that I mention as well. So classics were a big thing for me this year, and Frankenstein is where it all started, and what a crispy classic this one is. I really, really enjoyed Frankenstein. It was one that also surprised me, not quite as much as American Psycho did, but this was one that I was thinking I would have a hard time with because I had heard how different it was from the film, and it really is different from the film. The film is just you can hardly call it an adaptation. It's more like inspired by Frankenstein than it is anything else. And this book is one that I really, really, really loved. In fact, the entire section involving, let's just say, interactions with the monster that happened in volume 2, that is as far or as spoilery as I'll go. That section of this book is one of my favorite passages that I ever read throughout the entirety of the year. It had me captivated the entire way through, one that I was fully sold and in on. I just really enjoyed Frankenstein as a whole, even though I think a lot of people who don't love it really dislike it, because it's again another situation kind of like American Psycho, where if you're not really a fan of what it's doing, there's nothing in it for you. So It was one that I really loved, but as you can tell by it being number 5 on this list. So I recommend people give it a shot, obviously, because I'm going to recommend all the books that I love to people just because I want them to read it. But this is one that I really adored, and I'm very glad. Like I'm really quite glad that it was my reintroduction into classics and was what frankly gave me the passion to read more classics throughout the rest of the year. Coming in at number 4 is one out of a series of 8 books. That is The Dark Tower by Stephen King. Yes, the final book is the one that makes it up on this list. And if you watched my Dark Tower ranking video and got all the way through it, you know that The Dark Tower was number 1 on that list. Anyway, this is easily my favorite of the entire series. It's kind of hard for me to explain why it's my favorite of the series because a lot of it has to do with spoiler related stuff. But there was not a single dull moment in this book. To the fact that I binged through it. I am not a quick reader, but I read this entire 250,000 word book in 1 week. 1 week it took me to read this thing, which means that if I had read at that pace for the entirety that I read, say, War and Peace, it would have only taken me like 2 or maybe 2.5 weeks. That is insane type of reading pace for me. But I got through this one that quick because I was loving every single second of it. And it has basically 3 conclusions. It has the conclusion of the main story, but then it has the epilogue, and then it has the coda, and all of that was fantastic. I just think that the way that this book wrapped up the entire series was pitch perfect. I could not believe that King wrapped it up this good, especially knowing how controversial the last book is. There are a couple problems with it that I understand some other people having. They were not issues that I had with this book at all in any way, shape, or form. I loved The Dark Tower. Next up, we're talking about another classic, and in fact, this is the oldest book that I read this year. Might be one of the oldest books that I ever read throughout the entirety of my life. This book was The Iliad by Homer, an epic poem rooted in Greek history and mythology, in, stuff that I've always had a passion for. As a kid, I loved Rick Riordan, and Riordan definitely inspired and, sparked a passion for all things ancient history and mythology to me. And the Iliad was one that satisfied on that. When I reread Percy Jackson and the Olympians, and the Iliad being a book that I always wanted to read at one point in time, when this was voted to be the monthly classic for September, and I had been voting for it for several months before that as well, I needed to read this book. And it definitely very much surprised me, nearly as much as American Psycho did. This was one that I had reservations for just because of it being so old, and to an extent I can see why I had those, because this isn't really a narrative the way that we normally think of narratives today, but it is one that I very much enjoyed reading, and one that, even though there are some minor things that even I don't like about it, it was in a sense the easiest 5-star in my life, because it was just such a profound and amazing piece of work. I cannot wait to read the Aeneid at some point, because I know that it has a lot of influence from the Iliad as well, and also tells the story that a lot of people think that the Iliad tells, which is the Trojan horse story. The Iliad does not have the Trojan horse story. I'm pretty sure that one's actually in the Aeneid. But either way, the Iliad is definitely one worth reading. It is a lot more approachable than you think it is. I promise you that. Coming in at number 2 was one that I actually just finished this morning, but was a decision that I had to spend a lot of time agonizing over, especially when I recorded it in my tier list ranking video. Again, talking about those, I'll be covering those on a lot of the next few Thursdays over January and in February. Number 2 is Demon in White by Christopher Ruocchio. And, Demon in White is an amazing, amazing book. It's, to an extent, you could consider, it's at least 2 books in one binding, but it could be considered 3 books in one binding, because there are no less than 3 climaxes. 2 of them are combat-related climaxes, and one of them is a not combat-related climax. To say the least, almost every single page of this book was perfection. I loved, the entirety of the first act was, incredible. The entirety of the first act of Demon in White is probably my favorite thing in Sun Eater, not counting Parliament of Owls from Tales of the Sun Eater Volume 1. Act 3 has a lot of crazy stuff happen that caught me off guard, that I was not expecting, especially the last chapter. Even Act 2 was very, 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 very good in the way that it was paced and the way that information was revealed and lore and a bunch of other stuff that I can't get into because spoilers. But Demon in White was a book that it took me until the very last chapter before I determined if it was better than Helling Dark. That is how close this list was. Very hard decision to make between this one and Helling Dark, and frankly, part of me still regrets picking this one over Helling Dark, but part of me would also regret picking Helling Dark over this one. Speaking of Helling Dark, let's talk about my honorable mentions for this list. Obviously, I'm just going to go ahead and start off the honorable mentions with Howling Dark because of all the reasons that I said. If, the cover art and title were included in this to make it easier to tie break Howling Dark and Demon in White, Howling Dark would probably be my favorite just because I love the title and what it means. And I love the art a lot more than I like the art of Demon in White. However, when it comes right down to it, if we're talking story matter, Howling Dark and Demon in White are just so close together in quality and worth that it is dang near impossible to really decide which one is better than the other one. Now, in terms of the rest of my honorable mentions, I'll go ahead and mention a couple of the bottom ones first. One that surprised me that I think is worth shouting out because it isn't nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be, being, let me go ahead and switch scenes here to this. I'm going to go ahead and put a picture over on this side of the screen. This is The Wandering Inn, Volume 1, also Book 1 if you're doing the audio version, which I did, by Pirate Abba. The Wandering Inn is a story, a web novel that I was not expecting to enjoy as much as I did. There were a couple very annoying elements and a chapter that nearly made me DNF it because it annoyed and pissed me off so much. But the ending of the story made it all worth it because the author made some decisions throughout this that were quite surprising to me, like several decisions that are like, wow, that was a ballsy move for sure. And even though it isn't worth, it isn't good enough to be in the top 10 by any means, it is one that I felt I needed to shout out because I did enjoy it a lot more than I thought I would, and because it surprised me, and because there is potential for future volumes to end up on something like a top 10 list, depending on what they do with the story and with the characters. So, take that as you will. The next honorable mention, I'll also show an image over there, being The Emperor's Feast by Andrew Clavin, Book 3 of Another Kingdom. This was another trilogy that I did on audiobook, which is not something that I do too common, but The Emperor's Feast, I don't know if I said The Emperor's Soul before. I hope I didn't say The Emperor's Soul, because that is not what it is. The Emperor's Feast by Andrew Clavin was very good. I thought Another Kingdom as a first book in this trilogy was very innovative, especially in the way that it utilized the portal fantasy element. I really enjoyed it for bringing together classic, traditional fantasy world alongside a modern world and using storylines that happen in both of them to tell a story and to, have an arc. The Nightmare Feast, the middle book, definitely lagged a little bit. I remember next to nothing about that book, but The Emperor's Feast made the entire journey so worth it. Even though it isn't highbrow literature by any means, it did almost take the place of, say, The Last Olympian or The Serpent's Shadow on the top 10 list, because the way that I remember this book is very good. It tied together everything, both the storylines and both worlds, all the elements, everything just wrapped together in such a way that I really, really enjoyed. As you can tell from this list, I tend to enjoy wrap-ups, with being The Last Olympian, The Serpent's Shadow, Return of the King, holy cow, The Dark Tower, Emperor's Feast, all on this list. Dude, that's hilarious, actually. Go ahead and switch back to the full screen so that I can talk about the next couple honorable mentions, I think, because there are two of these I haven't mentioned. The next honorable mention will be The Odyssey by Homer, which I talked about a little bit. The reason this one didn't make it on the list instead of the Iliad is because the Iliad shocked me in how much I enjoyed it when I was expecting to be more reserved on it. The Odyssey was one that I was already very familiar with, so the shock factor wasn't there. That's pretty much why it wasn't on the list. The other honorable mention is Wizard in Glass, because even though I think this book would have been better if part one of it were in the Wastelands instead, Wizard in Glass in parts 2 and 3, the flashback, Roland's flashback, one of the best things I've read all year, period. Like, it is so good. Parts 2 and 3 of Wizard and Glass are good enough that I could see myself rereading them on their own just because I can. And they hit me really emotionally, like a gut punch, a couple different places, especially at the very end of that flashback, in ways that are just like super, super personal to me. I loved Wizard and Glass. I was sure that it would be my favorite in the entire series, but then The Dark Tower came around and blew all of my expectations out of the water. So let's finally talk about number 1. I'm sure anybody watching this video, not having seen this yet on the list, knows exactly what this is, especially when I reviewed it and talked about it otherwise. Another big chunky boy, Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. I don't want to gush too much in this video because the video has already gone on long enough, but Les Mis was in almost every respect, to me, a perfect book. There are some things that you could consider problems with it, such as Hugo's tendency to ramble on sometimes about things that don't really matter to the story, with entire books within the parts of the story being dedicated to these tangents, as we like to refer to them as, including one tangent on slang that a lot of people absolutely despise, tangent on nuns, and whatnot, that didn't necessarily have to do with the story, but was tangentially related enough that I even still loved that. Pretty much all the tangents, even I still enjoyed a lot. Part of that was because the writing of this edition, especially the 2013 translation by Christine, I don't know how to pronounce her last name. It's Doniger, I think. It might be something else. I apologize if I'm pronouncing that name wrong, but this translation in the Penguin Classics Deluxe Edition, I'm pretty sure there's a normal Penguin Classics edition of the book just called The Wretched. That is this translation of Les Mis. That is incredible. The translation is perfect. Like, there's two copy edit errors, right? Like, there's one instance of the wrong type of quotation mark being used, and then there's one instance of two words being in the wrong order. Other than those two copy edit errors, there's nothing wrong with this translation, and it was a joy to read the entire way through. If you are scared of classics because of old or archaic writing, pick this up in this translation because it feels modern without losing any of the essence of the old or original story. It is incredible. I loved Les Mis so much. I pretty much call it perfect, with, a paragraph or a line, I can't remember if it was a paragraph or a line on the very last page, that is like one of my favorite quotes in all of fiction, period. One of my favorite quotes in all of fiction is on the last page of this book, and the only reason it means so much to me is because of the 1,300 pages that came before it. It is incredible. If you have not read Les Mis, I highly, highly recommend it, even through the tangents, because the main story is so worth it. So, that's the ranking. I'm sure this video went on a little bit longer than I wanted it to. We'll see how long it turns out post-edit, because I spent several minutes at the very beginning just trying to get all the books to fit in the thumbnail. And of course, I didn't even get to fit the honorable mentions in the thumbnail. It was just the stack of the main books. I had a really great reading year. I'm very surprised by how many of these books I loved so much, and several of them came as big surprises to me, like American Psycho, even Frankenstein to an extent, Les Mis to an extent as well, a book that I wanted to read pretty much since like 4th grade, since I learned how to read, essentially. I've wanted to read Les Mis. I had a great reading year. Let me know in the comments below what some of your favorite books of the year were. If you read any of the books that I have on this list, how much did you enjoy them yourself? I would really, really actually like to know. I'm very interested because, like I said, I had a great reading year, and I'm very excited to have another great year in 2023. Thank you guys for watching. As always, I appreciate all of the support that you guys have been giving me ever since I essentially revamped and restarted this channel back in 2022. So thank you guys again for watching. I'll be back again. I believe this video comes out on a Thursday. I'm pretty sure it does. On Monday, sorry, not on Monday, because these videos don't come out on Monday anymore. These videos come out on Tuesdays and Thursdays now. On episode 51 coming out next Tuesday, I will be talking about what I'm excited to read in 2023. So, kind of related to what I was just talking about. Some general 2023 TBR stuff that I'm excited about. So if you are interested in that, I highly recommend subscribing to the channel so that you don't miss when that video comes out. It'll come right to your feed. But anyways, thank you guys for watching. I'll be back again on Tuesday with the next episode of the Book Binge. See you then.